After Show with TelecomTV's Guy Daniels and Ray Maistre.
I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content, and we are broadcasting live at the end of our Spotlight on 5G series. This is the second of 3 of our live shows. We have our final program for you on Thursday, tomorrow at the regular time. And we're taking a look back at last week's activity around MWC 22 in Barcelona and answering your questions on 5G with the help of our guests, of course. Now, if you haven't yet got in touch, then do so now, and the sooner the better. Please don't leave it until the end of the show. We had a couple of late questions yesterday which we couldn't fit in. There's a form on the website below this video that you can use, and there's also a poll question. It's nice and simple, so go ahead and cast your vote now. As always, your co-host for the after show is Ray Maistre, Editorial Director at TelecomTV. Good show yesterday, Ray, with a broad range of questions, I felt, emphasising really that we're just in the early stages of 5G and there's still a lot of innovation and development yet to come.
Yeah, absolutely, Guy. It is still relatively early days, but we're now a couple of years into major 5G rollouts. So the industry has a fairly good idea of whether the reality is meeting the promise. It seems to me that the excitement levels amongst end users, the ones that pay for services and so provide the industry's cash flow, aren't really moving the needle too much right now. Let's hope that innovation comes soon. But it is tricky, of course. There are a lot of moving parts. And as one of our guests noted yesterday, 5G only really has an impact once the entire telco architecture is underpinned by a distributed cloud-oriented IT platform, the underpinning foundations of 5G. And without that, well, you're just building the equivalent of a garden shed instead of a mansion, if you'll indulge that terrible building metaphor. I feel this might be a good time to hand back over to you, Guy.
You never get anywhere unless you've got the right foundations in place, Ray. And that's just as true for telecoms. Then on with the show, and let's meet our guests. And joining us live on the program today are Rabia Debussy, who is Chief Revenue Officer for Rakuten Symphony, Miguel Karamis, who is Executive Director of Cloud and Technology Planning at Verizon, Rima Yontel, who's Chief Architect, TME Technology, Strategy and Execution Office at Red Hat, Martin Taylor, Office of the CTO, Azure for Operators at Microsoft, Rolf Eberhardt, who is Head of Orchestration with the Communications Technology Group at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and Francis Haysom, Principal Analyst with Appledore Research. Hello, everyone, and it's good to see you all. We've got lots of audience questions to get through, so let's get cracking. And Ray, do you have our first question?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Guy. So we're going to start this question by putting this one to you, Rima. And it's quite one of the big questions, I guess, in the 5G world. 5G was supposed to be a great revenue driver for operators, but at the moment, it just looks like a lot of extra investment for very little return. Did the industry miscalculate? Rima, what's your view on this? Is it too early to say whether 5G has been a bit of a miscalculation for the industry?
So the great driver for 5G was supposed to be enterprises. So things like business to business, IoT, connected cities, smart cars, connected healthcare, all of that, right? But in most markets that we're seeing, the first rollouts of 5G are consumer oriented. So I think it's a bit early to say because the main revenue generators have not been really deployed yet and have not been taken up yet. And I think the reason might be that the workloads and the use cases that would fit into that category have not been fully developed yet. So the application providers are lagging a little bit in taking advantage of the capabilities of 5G, and that's why a lot of the service providers are focusing on the consumers, regular users first.
Okay, thanks, Rima. Yes, and I think that many people in the industry would agree with you. I guess the person who has put this question in was maybe taken in by the excitement and dare I use the word hype around 5G. Does anybody else want to come in and maybe give a view on this? Whether yes, Martin, let's come to you, and Francis.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody recognised that 5G would happen in multiple phases, and the first phase was always going to be enhanced mobile broadband, get 5G out there to address congestion problems in heavily loaded cells, improve coverage, improve speeds, and the consumers are not really going to feel the benefit of that. It's more what they do at the margins, in particularly in congested cities. But the second wave, I think, as Rima said, it hasn't arrived yet, simply because partly because the standards aren't really there yet, and partly because the infrastructure rollout needs to be there, and that was always going to be driven by enhanced mobile broadband. But the revenue generating use cases, the enterprise use cases, will follow.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Rolf, we'll come to you next, and then come back up to the top of the deck there with Francis. So, Rolf, what do you think? Do you think that maybe there was a bit too much promised early on for 5G?
We've discussed this. Remember 4G? We've discussed it the same at that time. Everybody was asking, where is the killer app? And it turned out that we were at least economically successful with that technology as well, just as any other, and it will happen here as well. I do really see a lot of large enterprises now revving up. Many of them are actually waiting for the hardware to be around so that we can actually do an execution. You need to have a modem for a starter. If you don't have a modem, you cannot really connect your IoT device to a system. It will come for sure.
Okay, thanks, Rolf. And Francis, what's your view? I mean, you've been looking at the industry as an analyst for many years. Are you surprised that there's maybe a little bit of cynicism around 5G?
I think we need to separate two things. One of which is that the obviously 5G today is really about that consumer. It's a kind of 4G plus. 5G promises a lot more. Rima's comment about it's for enterprise is very important. But I think the real challenge here is not one of technology. Sure, the standards need to be in place, but a lot of it is actually to do with very different business models that are required for things like IoT, and even some of the sort of ultra low latency applications. It's not a typical operator model that we're used to at the moment. And a lot of the challenge of 5G, or the success of 5G, will be about our ability to, in marketing terms, cross the chasm from very early sort of demonstrations to equivalent mass markets in enterprise, manufacturing, transport, etc. And that will be really the thing that makes the difference for 5G for me. It's the business model and the thinking behind that business model.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that's an opinion that would be echoed widely across the industry. Okay, thanks very much for your responses to that question. And Guy, I think we'll hand over to you for our second question of today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ray. We've got a question here around Open RAN. So, Rabia, I'm going to put this to you first, if I may. The question is Open RAN the main driver for RAN transformation and innovation, or are there other technologies also being used?
Well, Guy, definitely Open RAN brings to the radio and access domain a lot of benefits. It is about the disaggregation of hardware and software from existing monolithic systems that we've been used to across all the generations of the past. But the benefit and the innovation of Open RAN has a much more profound and multi-dimensional benefit by introducing softwareization and virtualization into the RAN domain. You basically unlock the potential for you to have edge compute, edge services, cross-domain automation and orchestration, the introduction of AI and ML, and the ability for smaller firms that did not have the chance to provide services and applications in the access domain to now have the opportunity to do that. So if we look at RAN alone, then yes, the disaggregation of hardware and software has, and the leverage of COTS and the standard cloud and virtualization technologies. But when you look at it across the network, it's got a multidimensional and a significant, profound effect on the use of such technology.
Great, thank you very much, Rabia. As you say, it's all part of the disaggregation story there. Any other thoughts about Open RAN and what other technologies may run alongside? Miguel, please.
Yeah, so I guess the question is interesting in the way it's formulated. So definitely not the only driver, an important driver, but there were steps being taken kind of more incremental, if you would, with virtualized RAN, centralized RAN. And then when you look at some of the other techniques that were already being applied, like self-optimizing networks and all of technology on the air interface itself, like massive MIMO and so on, I think what you get from ORAN is the ability, like Ravi said, right, disaggregate and apply some of the principles we had been using on the core for a while already into the RAN domain now, and create the opportunity for disruption, smaller players with unique tech to have an opportunity to compete that maybe before they didn't have, right, because the systems were vertically integrated. But there is a lot of technology that's being put into RAN in addition to ORAN.
Great, thanks, Miguel. As you say, there's a lot of other companies out there who now got more prominence or more ability to participate in some of these operations thanks to this aggregation. Francis, I'll come to you, and then Remy will come to you. So Francis first.
Yeah, I'd just be very brief. I'd echo Rabi's comment, which is it's really about the ability to leverage software innovation speed, really. We don't quite know what that will be, but the ability to interact at a very different speed than hardware typically is. So the ability to unbundle that allows lots of people to develop very quickly and innovation to happen in that kind of speed. So that's the key driver for me.
Great, thanks, Francis. And Rimmer, the question here about whether Open RAN is the key driver of transformation and innovation, or whether or not other technologies are also being used.
Yeah, so I just wanted to highlight one more thing in the automation space that was already mentioned, but use of traditional IT development methods like DevOps, which has been transformed into GitOps when you look at the networks, is one of the great drivers, because that allows you to develop faster and to scale bigger. And without that, deploying at scales that Open RAN would require would almost be impossible, in my opinion.
Thanks very much, Rimmer. Okay, well, I think we best move on. A lot of questions to get through. So, Ray, let me hand over to you for our next question.
Okay, thanks, Guy. So here's a question we're going to put to you first, Rolf. And I'm surprised we haven't had more questions about private 5G, but here's one that we got in today. Is private 5G only for large corporates, only for large corporate users? Is it a niche market, or will lots of companies be able to afford to run their own private 5G networks? Rolf, what's your view here?
We are seeing the first wave of private 5G coming through the large corporates. Yeah, for sure. And this mainly has to do with the strategic importance 5G can provide to these corporate users. And so they're placing an emphasis on this. So, for example, large manufacturing sites where they're going into to digitally transform, moving to a digital twin type solution. And there they definitely need to have a private 5G environment. That said, however, I'm seeing a large uptake on asks from midsize, where they want to take the benefits of private 5G also into their environments, and there we come to the ask to CSPs, to telcos: are you able to help me with an as a service private 5G motion? because the mid-sized companies just don't have the size and the strength to do it themselves. So they will be extremely interested in an as-a-service approach, which is either an in-a-box deployment or a multi-site type deployment, private 5G environments, where they're then able to place their applications into the environment in a simple fashion. So start number one, yes, large corporations, they are leading the way. Number two, for sure mid-size. And what's going to be extremely important is the private 5G part will just be part of a business transformation solution. So it's going to be private 5G and Wi-Fi coming together, because at the end of the day, the companies are interested in establishing their digital connectivity, for example.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rolf. And Miguel, let's come to you, and then we'll come up to Francis. Is it too early to know really what the kind of cost analysis of private 5G is, and is it going to be suitable for lots of companies?
Yeah, so I can tell you the way we are looking at this is we need to address the entire market spectrum, right? And so we have a bigger product that we launched last year, part of the on-site overall program, which is more tailored for larger installations and enterprises that have very stringent requirements, right? Whether it's performance or reliability and so on. But then we also announced a more as a service, right, type deployment last week, which is more oriented to smaller, like maybe smaller deployments or companies that are interested in the technology, but maybe not 100% ready to deploy it at scale. So they want to play, test, and learn. So it's a developing market, right? That's a reality. There is a lot of activity in the marketplace. Here in the US, CBRS has enabled, right, a lot of this development to occur, because now you have access to unlicensed spectrum. The same is happening in other countries too. But I think, we see both streams already happening in the marketplace, right? Like a smaller, simpler service type opportunities for some of the smaller businesses, and then very large systems, right, that are almost telco grade from a performance or reliability perspective, and anything in between, and already going to market.
Okay, interesting. Francis, will come to you next, and then Rabia.
Yeah, I was going to very brief. I think we've got to consider enterprises, whether large or small, don't have a 5G problem. They have enterprise problems that 5G may be able to solve. So there's the opportunity. I'll echo Rolf's comment, which is for those that can package that in a way that's easily consumable by an SME, there is an opportunity. The second thing I'd add is I think a lot of the success as we go down into the smaller SME area is going to be about how the government regulates and allocates spectrum and the models for spectrum in the area. If you make it too hard, it's unlikely to fly, and Wi-Fi will probably continue, or public spectrum.
Okay, thanks, Francis. And Rabia, how are you seeing the private wireless networks market come together?
Yeah, I think there's a misnomer here, because not every enterprise will need a 5G, and I think Francis hit it pretty accurately. So it all depends on the use cases, and let's also understand that the 5G spectrum is a licensed spectrum in most nations and most countries. We can talk about CBRS, which doesn't fit in that category. But in general, our 5G deployment in Japan has been used for consumer services, and we're seeing a lot of benefits there. But if we take a look at the enterprises, unless you have a need for ultra low latency or ultra high capacity to automate manufacturing and processing, to provide remote telemetry, remote control such as remote health, etc., then you would be fine as an enterprise with Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi 6. Only when you start looking at use cases where you really need to tap into the ultra high bandwidth of millimeter wave or above, you could go up to 70 gigahertz, for example, or you need extremely low latency, then 5G becomes a reasonable technology for you to deploy as an enterprise. And it doesn't have to be independent from the telcos. The telco could help you implement it. On the cost aspect, what we're seeing in some of the radio units, leveraging some merchant silicon and commodity silicon, the drive of the cost reduction and the drive of reducing cost of the radio infrastructure has really almost gotten to a level of a Wi-Fi access point. So it's feasible in the future that many small enterprises could leverage the benefit of that cost reduction.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think that's what a lot of people want to hear about the base costs. Of course, that's before the OPEX, of course. But okay, fantastic answers, I think, to that question. Thanks very much, everybody. Guy, over to you.
Yep, thanks very much, Ray. I see we are getting a few more questions in from our audience, so thanks very much. Keep them coming in. It's time now, though, to check in on our audience poll for this year's Spotlight on 5G series. One question about 5G, 5 multiple choice answers. I'm afraid you can only pick one. And the question we are asking this week is, which of the following will have the most positive impact on 5G service capabilities and ROI potential for operators? And you can see the real-time voting here. And just as yesterday, AI and automation is still in the lead with millimeter wave in a distant 5th place there. Now, if you have still yet to vote, then please do so. The more votes, the better, the more representative it will be. We're keeping the polls open and we'll take a final look at the results in tomorrow's live after show. Okay, back to our Q&A. We are about 22 minutes or so into the program now, but we still have plenty of time to answer more of your questions. So Ray, over to you for our next one.
Okay, thanks, Guy. And Miguel, will come to you first with this question. And the question is, what are the challenges in deploying network slicing in a multi-vendor core environment? So very, very specific question here around network slicing. What would you say the key challenges there are?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I don't know that the challenges are necessarily tied to network slicing as such. Like you have to operate in a multi-vendor environment if you want to select best in breed. Right, so and I think we talked about this in previous sessions. We are strong believers. We've operated in a multi-vendor environment and a core for many years, including the 4G side. What slicing adds is obviously another layer of complexity. Now you have many options, a lot of flexibility, placement of different workloads in different parts of the network to meet the use cases and so on. So what we are saying in the early work that we're doing is, so first of all, you need to make sure you align the multiple domains, so not just core, but core, RAN, transport, obviously, and device support. That's very important. Setting governance, at least early on, right? So your risk, for lack of a better description, building a one-off dedicated slice for every single use case, which may or may not be manageable and supportable, at least in the early days. So we're trying to make sure that we do all this governance upfront, and really we define these use cases that need certain requirements that drive the need for a specific slice type, and then we can manage instances of that slice type. Right? So governance is important. And then really from the multi-vendor aspect is all about strict documentation and then integration, right? So we feel like we've been doing this for many years now, going back to the original 4G deployment. So we are doubling down on some of that work, right? So we have all our vendor partners collaborate in our version of the interface specs, code flow development, kind of how we are going to be measuring performance and so on. So then we can drive automation around that and make sure that we can assess the real performance of each of those slices across the multiple domains and then across the multiple vendors. So that's the way we're approaching it. Less about the slicing problem and more about kind of having good governance and good processes internally.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Miguel. Yeah, we'll come to Rabia first.
Sure. So Miguel is right. I'd like to add on that. I mean, if we go back in history, let's think about how we managed quote unquote slicing in the previous generations. So let's look at GPRS and 3G. And let's say a utility company wants to digitize their meters. We allocated SIMs that are within a specific APN to simply give a different quality of service, different security, different isolation of the traffic that is coming from those digital meters by a tool used called APN access point name. So that was kind of a methodology, and the five quality of service categories that we've implemented. I don't think the slicing is going to be at a level of consumer and use cases that are unnecessary for you to isolate and provide dynamic allocation of network resources. Where slicing becomes really critical is when you have either a need to completely isolate from the rest of the traffic, such as critical national infrastructure, emergency services, use cases that are essential to the economy, society, the operations of a country, or a specific use case that requires a very unique radio spectrum or unique service that is provided on top of that radio spectrum. Again, bringing us back to the use cases, which will have to be defined as we roll out 5G. Now, Release 18 introduced also network sharing and RAN sharing, which definitely creates a new dynamics and a new dimension for network slicing, which become very useful for that type of use case.
Okay, fantastic. Great answer there. So good, in fact, that you actually answered one of the other questions that's just come in about whether network slicing is going to be applied to individuals as well. So thank you for that. Rima, let's come to you next.
Yeah, so I wanted to look at another dimension of how do you provide a network slice end-to-end. And one of the challenges that is still being resolved, in my opinion, is how do you enforce that slice, right? And how do you not strand your resources in the slice once you set it up, and you potentially don't need it anymore, or it's not being utilized to the full extent that you expected. And if you want your slice to go all the way, from your antenna through your optical network, your backhaul, all the way into your cloud, how do you correlate all of the events happening in each of the domains? Because that technology is still being developed. The understanding, the ability to react to events, and then move your workloads, make dynamic changes based on the information, or if something fails, how do you move your slice? All of those things, they still need to be resolved. And since we already talked about the fact that consumer 5G is being rolled out first before all the enterprise stuff, we still have time to figure it out. And there hasn't been that urgent need to do it yet. So it's still in the process of being put together.
Okay, great. And that, I think that'll be interesting for a lot of people to hear, because I know there is sort of some messaging out there in the market that already this end-to-end, cross-operator, cross-domain slicing is already possible, but maybe that's not in a multi-vendor environment. Okay, Guy, I think we can move over to you for the next question at this point.
Right, thanks, Ray. Next question in, Martin. I think if we may, we'll start with you on the responses for this one. And the question is, what's the best role for public cloud platforms in 5G for end user services and applications? So I guess the question here is focusing on the end user services, not so concerned about network functions and workloads. Martin, you got any thoughts on this one?
Sure. I mean, the question clearly is directed at the application layer, but I do think it's worth saying one or two things about the network function layer and other aspects of 5G infrastructure here, and to point out that hyperscale cloud has huge potential to help operators with their 5G deployments. Initially, perhaps by hosting analytics, ingesting metrics and applying AI and getting actionable insights and so on out of that. We're seeing a lot of operators already doing that. And then, we see operators starting to move some of their network functions into hyperscale cloud because it simply saves them from building and operating their own NFV infrastructure. And to start with, that would be subscriber management and policy, some of the sort of more centralized stuff. But there's absolutely no reason why you can't put the control plane into hyperscale cloud as well. And of course, it's worth remembering that we have this picture in our head that hyperscale cloud means 2 or 3 big regions in an entire country. But remember, hyperscale cloud is coming to the edge and is going hybrid. We announced at Mobile World Congress this Azure Operator Distributed Services, which is an on-prem cloud designed for telco network function workloads, but very much managed from the hyperscale core. So, sorry for the digression there, but coming back to the question about end user applications, of course, hyperscale cloud already supports a ton of things, in the IoT universe. Lots and lots of 5G networks are going to be feeding metrics and sensor inputs and so on, and events into backends hosted in hyperscale clouds that are going to ingest those events and provide reports and analysis and so on. And then I think there's things like games and game streaming. That's becoming big as a sort of competitor to the console space. And of course, I have to mention metaverse. Right now, mixed reality is a big deal for enterprises, and I think 5G will have a big impact there. And again, hyperscale clouds are very strong in terms of support for digital twinning applications and those kinds of things with mixed reality. That will eventually come to the consumer space. And who knows, in 10 years' time, people might be wandering around with head-mounted displays as their main means of interacting with the virtual world.
Yeah, they may well do indeed, Martin. Yes, and we have, I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions around the metaverse and even, more closer to home and in a shorter time frame, the cloud gaming side of it. Now, we've got a couple more responses here. So let's first of all go up to Francis.
I'm going to say a slightly unusual, non-technical one. I think the biggest role they can play is actually as a role model to telco and CSP in terms of the way as a service, on-demand, API-driven, collaborative models for developing new innovation can work. I think it's a key driver. If you compare a typical telco order process to an Amazon or Microsoft order process, they are chalk and cheese, and I think they can drive a very different model in telco and 5G.
That's interesting. Thanks for that, Francis. And Rabia, let's go over to you.
I'd like to say here that there is an opportunity of collaboration. Given that the transformation in the mobile networks infrastructure is moving more and more towards softwareization, virtualization, and cloud, there's a huge potential between the hyperscalers and the application providers of the existing cloud environment as a service or a revenue share model, which really would transform the whole industry. In the past, we've struggled and called the application providers based on cloud an OTT, a business that was supposed to monetize without any revenue share with the telcos. And I think that there's an opportunity for collaboration. But I'd like to add to the comment around the network functions and the network workloads. Potentially core and operational technologies could be deployed, but here I'd like to caveat that with the fact that there's some regulatory hurdles that we have to overcome, potentially deploying a hyperscaler node within the country. But most importantly, I think we need to differentiate between the clouds. Not all clouds are created equal. And the current hyperscalers cloud, from a technology point of view, is not able to address the needs of the radio access network. So we need to be careful there because there's a very, very unique and peculiar deployment requirements for the RAN workloads, near real-time functions of the VDU and the VCU.
Okay, Rabia, thank you very much for those comments. Do we have? I'm not sure if Rolf wanted to comment or not on that one. I couldn't quite see there, but do you have any more comments or any Anyone else want to contribute?
I think the important part on the hyperscalers and the cloud is really this massive disaggregation, which you're going to be seeing in the environment, for sure. And that's what we've been seeing with implementations and customers. With the RAN part, you're speaking of thousands of sites which you need to manage, and their NFV as such is actually still quite valid model and a valid approach for these kind of environments. So you'll have a mix. You'll have hyperscaler-based clouds. You'll have private ones as well, which are being deployed, which are fit to function. And I believe telcos will have to be able to work with both, with highly distributed environments, different vendors, just like we're talking about best of breed for our network functions. Well, what about having the same on the cloud layer?
Oh yeah, that's interesting, Rolf. Yes, indeed. And as you say, the clouds do come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Unless anybody else wants to comment on this, I think we should head on. Yes, Ray, I think we should head over to you for our next viewer question.
Okay, thanks, Guy. So this is a question that crops up in different guises in different summits and events that we run. Francis, is going to put this to you first. And the question is, how do we balance traditional standards with open interfaces and also ensure global compliance so as to avoid major market fragmentation? So I guess this kind of question has become even more relevant in the past couple of years. But where are we now in terms of the trade-off, I guess, between traditional industry standards and the increasing use of open interfaces and non-traditional telecom technologies?
I think the challenge we have here is that the Open RAN and a lot of 5G is increasingly being delivered by software, and the software process is a very different one to hardware. And the standards process associated with it is very, very different. If you're going to invest in a hardware interface between two things, you're talking a year's worth of effort in terms of silicon, etc. Software is a very different model, and it's a much more iterative model. So the first statement I'm going to make is that we need to be careful about not applying a kind of hardware model or viewpoint to the way that a lot of what the standard will be in terms of software development. The second thing I think that's going to be very important is changing some of the mentality, which is about the testing and the validation of that software versus what has typically been a hardware test validation process. So a lot more. Ruma talked earlier about the adoption of CI/CD processes, iterative test. We're going to need to start introducing that into the standards, and that will help a lot in terms of this fundamental fragmentation is one which can more easily be overcome in terms of iterative software. We're going to need to start adopting software approaches like test lab. I use the word very carefully, live here, but sort of lab and test in live, and an ongoing iterative testing process. And the final thing I think that's going to be really, really important in terms of Open RAN is blueprints. We're seeing that some of that in terms of things like, for example, MFA is working at blueprints to make 5G in private networks much easier to deploy and validate. And we're going to see the ecosystem players. We saw the huge announcement of Rakuten Symphony at the Mobile World Congress, and I think that's a big play. That doesn't mean ecosystems are about closing those interfaces. It's about making sure that things work together and can work together. And we're also seeing similar initiatives with the likes of players like HPE and Mavenir, for example. So I think there's a number of areas we can do here, but the fundamental thing, this is largely about software, and software has a very different methodology for standards and alignment.
Okay, thanks very much, Francis. Speaking of Rakuten Symphony, let's come to Rabia next.
Look, the standards are the standards, and we are quite fortunate to have such a diverse ecosystem who are participating to the standards. But I don't necessarily agree with calling the traditional systems. They are proprietary systems. They come from a handful of operators, although they adhere to the standards on the perimeter of their interfaces, but they haven't been able to design to the standard. For example, if you take an IMS architecture or core architecture or a RAN architecture from 3GPP release 15, the implementation of that system has been done in a monolithic proprietary environment, and you are locked to that environment. What the new standards allow you to do is they allow you to disaggregate, and as Francis said, bring software into the picture, eliminating the dependence on the proprietary hardware. So now you've disaggregated, you've broken the link between the proprietary hardware that came only from a handful of vendors to having a choice to provide compute, network, and memory for your resources, which, by the way, enables you to do auto healing, auto scaling, self-optimizing networks, elasticity of resources, basically right-sizing the resources, ultimately giving you tremendous benefit in bringing that disaggregation. And that's really what we plan to do to our customers, and that's what we implemented in Japan over the last 3 years.
Okay, thanks, Rabia. And Rima, let's come to you and then up to Martin.
All right, so I wanted to look at it from two different perspectives. One is to make sure everything stays open, you have to work in the open. As you know, we're big proponents of open source. We're also big proponents of working in open labs, like TIP community labs. Do your interrupt testing, share your results with the community, make sure that you fulfill, the requirements that you're looking for, but in a way that others can work with, right? So in an open way with open interfaces. Another aspect of the same thing is for the standards bodies not to be afraid of adapting de facto standards. Meaning if, the community is already doing it one way, don't try every time to reinvent the wheel and come up with new protocols, new types of definitions for interfaces. If it already exists, if there's a implementation of it that's been utilized by a lot of application vendors, just use that, right? You don't have to rewrite everything and reinvent everything. But another aspect of it, and here we're looking at the service providers, don't buy into the story of a monolithic proprietary solution that pretends to be an open solution. So if a vendor says, oh, sure, our implementation is open, it complies with standards with open interfaces, but you cannot take this piece out and put somebody else's, some other vendor's implementation in, that means it's a proprietary solution. It means you're being locked in. So be wary of it, test in multi-vendor environments, certify your solution in multi-vendor environments, and then people would be sort of forced to implement open interfaces and do the open standards.
Okay, thanks, Rima. That touched on a topic that was a pretty hot one yesterday as well, about just how open are some Open RAN offerings out there in the industry. Martin, let's come to you on this. How is the whole sort of standard specifications environment changing as we become more software and open interface oriented?
Standards exist in large part to ensure interoperability between different vendors' equipment in the network. But standards are not the only way to ensure interoperability. If vendors were prepared to publish their API specifications in a way that allows other people to work to them, often by doing that, you kind of get the best of both worlds. Standards can have the effect of chilling effect on innovation. They kind of lock people into a particular way of doing things for like a whole generation of mobile technology. Vendors often come up with better ideas, better ways of doing things. they often enhance the interfaces between pieces, and then you end up being locked into a proprietary implementation. But if operators tolerated departures from the standards, provided that vendors actually publish their API specifications, then I think we might have the best of both worlds.
Okay, thanks, Martin. And we'll finish off here with Rolf, because I can see that we are edging towards the end of the program. So, Rolf, would you like to close us off here?
Absolutely. My wish list: machine readable specifications, because then I don't have to go and try to pull specs out of Word documents. Attach postmans to it so that I can also do the interop tests in an early way to it. Second, standards, as was mentioned by Rima before, please be a bit faster, use Helm earlier onwards. And then last but not least, in 3GPP in particular, we have a very good network resource model, which gives a wonderful description of how you can describe business logic. Now we need to attach some intent-based policies to it so that we can actually describe similarly in machine-readable way how we would want to describe the operations of services, for example, in 3GPP. That would be my wish list.
Okay, thanks, Rolf. And surely somebody out there is thinking, I can do that, and sell it to Rolf. So some good business ideas there for some innovation in the industry. Okay, thanks very much. Guy, back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Unfortunately, I have no clue how to do that, so it won't be me getting rich quick. We are almost out of time, but we do have a couple of minutes left to squeeze in one final quick question to all of you. Now that MWC 22 is over and we've had time to digest all the news and activities, I'd like to ask all of you, what was your main takeaway from MWC? Whether you were there or not, what was your takeaway? So nice short answers, please. And Rolf, let's start with you.
Barcelona and tapas are still fantastic after 2 years in COVID. And otherwise, we are as an industry, we're moving ahead in this process, which we want to bring on 5G.
Excellent. Thanks, Rolf. I do miss the tapas. Rabia, let's come across to you. What was your main takeaway from MWC?
It was great to see the attendance this year versus last year. I was there last year as well. And my key takeaway is the appetite to do something different and new was quite refreshing. And that was represented by the whole ecosystem of participants. So that was great to see.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Miguel, having looked at all the news from MWC, what was your takeaway? What's your opinion of what happened and where the industry is at the moment?
Yeah, so unfortunately I didn't make it this year, so I did miss the tapas and the wine. But hopefully next year we'll do it all over again. I guess like when I look at the reports, internal and external, obviously lots of 5G, lots of private network, right? So I thought that was one of the things that I guess I was gladly surprised that it looks like some of this work that's been brewing for the last couple of years is now all of a sudden in the open, and there are many players across the ecosystem trying to play in private. So that was I thought that was really good.
Yeah, a lot of private 5G news and developments this year. Martin, across to you. What was your main takeaway from the show?
It was just terrific to be able to reconnect in person with customers and with co-workers. I mean, what a wonderful feeling to show up on the booth and meet people who I hadn't seen in person for 2 years, meet customers I hadn't seen in person for 2 years. I think, the biggest takeaway is you can sure get a hell of a lot done remotely on video links, but you don't know what you're missing until you come back together and discover what it is to work with people in person.
Exactly. Thank you, Martin. And Francis, what were your main takeaways from the show?
Yeah, I'd echo that really. It was so nice to see three-dimensional people and three-dimensional tapas and wine. It's not quite the same on a Zoom call in those aspects. I think in terms of the reaction, what I saw was a realism about 5G. Because of COVID, what the stands lacked on in terms of glamour and high spending, they actually made up for in terms of a lot more seriousness of thought. and particularly looking at things like what are the business models we need to do to make this a success. So for me, it was that different. It was less about technology. It was less about glitz. It was a lot more about realism, business models, and what it takes to succeed.
Thanks, Francis. And Rimmer, do you feel now that the industry is at a stage where we're taking a more realistic approach towards 5G, as Francis said?
Yes, unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it to Mobile World Congress, had to cancel last minute because you can't hop around Mobile World Congress on one foot. But from what I saw, it showed a great value of collaboration. So I saw a lot of different demos that involve multiple vendors working together on creating real solutions for the real world. And I thought that was of great value. Also because it showed that people did not stop working together, even in this really tough environment where, you couldn't get not only meet together, but you couldn't necessarily get into your lab in person. So you had to do everything remotely. And people were still able to produce great results and share them with everybody else. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks very much. Well, thanks, everybody. We are indeed out of time now. We're a little bit over time. Thank you so much to all of our guests who joined us for this live program and to our audience for sending in their questions. And we'll be back tomorrow with another live after show program.
And if you've got a burning question about 5G or any major trend or theme that emerged from MWC, then tomorrow is your final chance in this Spotlight on 5G series to put those questions to our industry experts. So remember to send in your questions for the after show as soon as you can. Don't leave it too late.
And don't forget the poll question either. There's still time for you to have your say. Vote now. Please join Ray and me again on Thursday for the third and final live after show for this year's Spotlight on 5G series. Until then, thank you for watching. Goodbye.
The after show was recorded in front of a live online audience.